Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thank you, Hema, for a very nice introduction. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here in Merida. It's my first visit to this lovely city. It's my first visit to this very interesting and impressive university. I've enjoyed the visit enormously, so thank you for your warm welcome. This afternoon, I'd like to speak on a topic which I think is very important, not just for Mexico, but for many other emerging economies throughout the world, and that is on the connection between globalization and increasing income inequality. I think I don't need to persuade you that there has been a great increase in globalization over the last 20 or 30 years. And by globalization, I mean two things. First, that there is now more trade of goods and services across countries, but also that the production process itself has been internationalized, so that goods are produced, the production process is not confined to a single country. A particular good at different stages in production moves to different countries. And that is a facet of globalization that I will be emphasizing later on in my talk. There are a number of well-known reasons why globalization has been increasing. First, it's now cheaper than ever to move things around the world. Shipping costs are lower than ever. But even more important, communication costs are lower than ever. So it's very easy to coordinate in production or in trade with someone around the world. You can instantly communicate with them, and you can very cheaply communicate with them. Also, at the political level, there has been an important decline in trade barriers. So now Mexico and the United States and Canada are joined together, for example, in a free trade agreement, which has been an important source of benefits to all three countries. Now, supporters of globalization have made many promises on its behalf. One promise was that globalization would bring prosperity to emerging economies. And this is a promise which, in many ways, has been delivered on. And we have only to look at China and India for examples of economies which have come an enormous way thanks to globalization. China was a poor country 40 years ago, and now it's a middle-income country, primarily because China has become one of the great export nations of the world. They got where they are today because of globalization. Similarly with India. But there's another promise that has been made on behalf of globalization, and that is that globalization was going to reduce the gap between the haves and the have-nots. In other words, globalization was going to reduce inequality in emerging economies, or at least that was the promise that was made. And this promise, unfortunately, has not come true, by and large. In fact, in many countries, including China, including India, including Mexico, inequality has actually increased. And that's a serious problem. It's a serious problem in every country, rich countries and emerging economies, but it's an especially serious problem in emerging economies. And today I want to concentrate on emerging economies like Mexico. Why is inequality such a problem in a country like Mexico? Well, first of all, there's a moral argument. Many of us accept the idea that people should be treated equally, at least as far as is possible. And if there's an enormous gap between rich and poor, that is morally offensive. It violates our egalitarian principles. That's a purely philosophical argument, a purely moral argument, which not everyone accepts. I happen to think it's quite compelling, but not everyone agrees with that. But even if they don't agree with that, they may well agree that getting rid of poverty is an important goal. But reducing inequality in emerging economies is actually quite similar to reducing poverty. One way of reducing poverty is to bring up the incomes of those at the bottom, to make the gap between rich and poor smaller. So that's going to help eradicate poverty, and it's also going to reduce income inequality. So getting rid of poverty and reducing inequality are clearly closely related. But even if you don't accept that argument, even if you don't care about ending poverty, there's a very practical reason why you might be worried about income inequality, and that's a stability argument. Countries where inequality is increasing tend to be less stable politically. It's harder to keep the country together if the country is becoming two different countries, a poor country and a rich country, and those two parts don't have much contact with one another. So simply for the sake of political stability, you may well care about reducing inequality. Now, from an economist's point of view, there's a very puzzling question that arises in connection with the fact that inequality has been rising in emerging economies, because that rise in inequality contradicts a very well-established theory in economics called the theory of comparative advantage. The theory of comparative advantage has been around for hundreds of years. It was first formulated by the British economist David Ricardo in the early 19th century. It's been a very successful theory. Many, many times over history, it has successfully explained the sort of international trade patterns that we've seen. And the theory of comparative advantage predicts that when globalization goes up, when free trade goes up, we should see a fall in inequality in emerging economies. But that's not what happened. At least that's not what happens in this particular period of globalization. Because the theory of comparative advantage is so important, I'd like to spend a few minutes explaining why comparative advantage, a theory of comparative advantage, leads to this conclusion that inequality should be falling, not rising. So, according to the theory, the reason why countries trade with one another is because they differ in their factors of production. Factors of production are inputs into the production process. If all countries were identical in how much of their various inputs they had, there would be no benefits from their trading with one another. It's the fact that the countries are different that makes trade worthwhile. Now, I'm particularly interested in income inequality in my talk today, and so I want to concentrate on labor as an input. Let's imagine that there are two kinds of labor. There is high-skilled labor. Those are people who have a lot of training or a lot of experience and are highly skilled. And then there's low-skilled labor, people without much by way of skill. And to understand why globalization leads to an increase, a decrease in inequality, let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that there are two countries. There's a rich country and there's an emerging country. And the rich country is rich because it has a higher proportion of high-skilled workers. So the ratio of high-skilled workers to low-skilled workers is higher in the rich country than in the emerging economy. And that means that the rich country has a comparative advantage in producing goods that require a lot of high-skill labor. So an example of such a good is computer software. To produce computer software, you don't need a lot of low-skill labor. What you do need are high-skill software engineers to produce the software. So a rich country has a comparative advantage in computer software. An emerging economy will have a comparative advantage in producing goods where skill doesn't matter as much. Agricultural goods often fall into this category, rice, for example. So the emerging economy will have a comparative advantage in rice. Now, I want to look at two snapshots. I want to look at production patterns and inequality before globalization occurs, and I want to look at production patterns and inequality after globalization occurs. So before globalization possible, before the rich country and the emerging economy can trade with one another, it's necessary for the rich country to produce both goods, both computer software and rice, because people in that country will want to have both software and rice, and they can't get the rice from elsewhere. They have to grow it themselves. So before globalization, companies in the rich country will be producing both software and rice, and the same is true in the emerging economy. The emerging economy will be producing both software and rice. But there's a sense in which producing software in the emerging economy is inefficient. It's inefficient because the emerging economy's labor force is better suited to rice, because there are all of these low-skilled workers. On the other hand, high-skilled workers in the emerging economy will benefit from the software production because they're very much in demand for software production. So before there is trade between the two countries, we will expect that low-skilled workers will have low wages in the emerging economy, and high-skilled workers will have high wages. But now let's imagine that the door between the rich country and the emerging country opens up, and now it's possible for the two countries to trade with one another. Well, what will happen? Well, we'll expect that the rich country won't have to produce rice anymore. They can shift production away from rice to software, and now they can import rice from the emerging economy. And the emerging economy will do just the opposite. It will shift production away from software to rice, and it will import its software from the rich country. And that means that the emerging economy will be producing more rice, less software than before, and this will be good for low-skill workers because rice uses a lot of low-skill labor. So the demand for low-skill labor will be higher, and that will push the wage for low-skill workers higher. On the other hand, the demand for high-skill workers will go down because the emerging economy is not producing as much software as before. So the high-skill wages will fall. If low-skill wages are rising, high-skill wages are falling, inequality is reduced in the emerging economy. So this is why supporters of globalization have argued that globalization will solve the inequality problem in emerging economies. This comparative advantage argument is the standard argument that they provide. And in fact, this argument has worked in previous globalization. The globalization period that we're going through now is not the first that the world has experienced. There have been 3 or 4 other globalizations, and in those other globalizations, the theory of comparative advantage was absolutely correct in its predictions. For example, there was a period of globalization in the late 19th century involving Europe, which at that time had a relative abundance of low-skill labor, and the United States. In the late 19th century, it became much easier to transport goods across the Atlantic Ocean because ships were so much improved, and so trade between Europe and the U.S. Increased. And just as the theory of comparative advantage predicted, inequality fell in Europe, just as it was supposed to. But for whatever reason, the theory has been less successful for the current globalization, suggesting that there's something different about this globalization from previous globalization. And it was that puzzle, what's different about this globalization, that got me interested in this set of issues. And so I was motivated, in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Michael Creamer, who's a development economist at Harvard, to develop an alternative theory, a new theory, not to replace comparative advantage theory, but to supplement it. And I would like to outline this alternative theory in the remainder of my talk. And I will outline it in a way similar to the way that I outlined theory of comparative advantage. That is, I will continue to do one of these thought experiments involving two countries, and we'll look at the before picture and the after picture. But the reason why we think that this globalization is different from previous ones is that this globalization has put a big emphasis on the internationalization of the production process itself. And to see what I mean by that, let's look at a standard example of a modern good which is produced in a modern way, and that is computers. Computers typically will be designed in one part of the world, perhaps the United States, and programmed in another part of the world, perhaps somewhere in Europe, and then assembled in some third part of the world, and often these days that's in China. So the production process itself is international. And computers, of course, are just one example out of many, many thousands of examples that I could give. So this will be a key ingredient of our theory, international production. Another key ingredient is that we're now going to talk about more than just two skill levels. We'll need many skill levels. Actually, to be precise, we'll need 4 skill levels. But as I said, I'm going to stick with my two countries, one country rich, one country emerging. And the rich country is rich because it has workers of higher skills. So there are going to be four skill levels, A, B, C, and D. A is highest, then B, then C, then D. So the rich country has the highest skilled workers, A and B, and the emerging country has the lowest skill levels, C and D. And production is accomplished by fulfilling certain tasks. If I'm a company and I want to produce something, there are certain jobs that will have to be filled for my company to produce outputs. We'll suppose, again, to make matters simple, that there are just 2 tasks that a company has to perform. One we'll call the managerial task, and this one will be highly sensitive to skill. In other words, the skill level of the person doing the managerial task will matter a lot. And then there'll be another job, which we'll call the subordinate task, which is less sensitive to skill. So the skill of the subordinate doesn't matter as much. And outputs will be produced when a company matches one person to be the manager and one person to be the subordinate. So these are, in this presentation, we'll think of a company as something very simple. It's just a 2-person production process, a manager and a subordinate. And we get output by hiring someone to be manager, hiring someone to be subordinate. And the amount of output will depend on the skill levels of the people who are performing those jobs. And this is the one, there's only going to be one mathematical formula in this talk, and here it is. The amount of outputs that a company produces will equal m² times S. Now, M is the skill level of the manager. S is the skill level of the subordinate. So this says that to calculate how much output we get, we square the skill level of the manager and multiply that by the subordinate skill level. So for example, if M equals 4 and S equals 3, the amount of output will be 4 squared, 4 times 4, times 3, or 48. And this formula gets across the idea that output is more sensitive to the skill level of the manager than it is to the skill level of the subordinate, because we square the skill level of the manager and we don't square the skill level of the subordinate. Now, what kind of matching pattern can we expect? Well, this will depend on the set of available workers. Let's look at a couple of examples. Suppose that we had a labor force that consisted of 2 workers of skill level 3 and 2 workers of skill level 4. So 2 3 workers, 2 4 workers. Well, there are 2 ways that we could match these workers. Here's one way. We could have a company which has a manager of skill level 4 matched together with a subordinate of skill level 3, and we could have another company which does the same thing. This is what is called cross-matching, because within a single company, we have 2 different skill levels. The skill level of the manager is different from the skill level of the subordinate. And you'll notice that if we do the calculation, this results in a total output of 96. The other way that we could match these workers is as follows. We could match one of the 4 workers with the other 4 worker, and one of the 3 workers with the other 3 worker, and this would give us a total output of 91. 91 is less than 96. So in this example, we will not see this matching pattern because it's inefficient. We'll see this one. We'll see cross-match. But if we change the labor force a bit, we would get a different matching pattern. Let's suppose that now we have 2 4 workers and 2 2 workers. So the gap between the high skill and the low skill workers has increased. Before it was 4 and 3, now it's 4 and 2. And once again, there are 2 ways that workers could be matched. We could have cross-matching, leading to output 64, or we could have homogeneous matching, leading to output 72, but now homogeneous matching is better. So in this case, we will expect to see this matching pattern, not this one. And these 2 examples illustrate that there are 2 different forces at work in our theory. There's one force which says that because the 2 jobs, the managerial job and the subordinate job, are not equally sensitive to skill, we should have a higher skill person in the managerial job than in the subordinate job, because the skill matters more in the managerial job. So that's an argument which says we should have cross-matching. But then there's a counter-argument which says that if the difference between the manager's skill and the subordinate skill is too big, well then we're wasting the high skill of the manager if his skill is just going to be brought down by the low skill of the subordinate. So that's an argument saying that we should have homogeneous matching. And which of the two we actually have will depend on the available labor force. What workers are actually available. And so that brings us back to our two countries. So remember, the rich country has workers of skill level A and B. The emerging country has workers at skill level C and D. I want to look at what happens before globalization occurs. International production is possible. And what happens after international production is possible. So this is the pattern that we get before globalization. Before globalization, we could not have international production. All production has to go on within a country. So it's all domestic. So these two workers are going to be matched together. The A and B workers are going to be matched together in the rich country, and the C and D workers are going to be matched together in the emerging economy. That's what we get before we can have international production. But once international production becomes possible, the matching pattern changes. And now we see the B workers in the rich country being matched with the C workers in the emerging. This picture got distorted a little bit. Let's look at it this way. So we have B workers in the rich country being matched with C workers in the emerging economy. That means that the D workers, who used to be matched with C workers, now have to match with each other. So we get homogeneous matching for the D workers, but the C workers get matched with the rich country B workers. That's what the theory predicts. Now, what effect does this have on wages and inequality? Well, before globalization, that is when we're in this scenario, D workers were matched with C workers. That was very good for the D workers, because if you're working with someone who has higher skill than you do, that's good for you because it enhances your productivity and it means that you're likely to be paid more. But after globalization, the C workers are no longer working with D workers. We just have D workers working with other D workers. That means that the D wage is likely to fall or at best stay the same. So D worker wages are not improving. But on the other hand, the C worker wages are going to go up because C workers have this great new opportunity. They can join the international labor force. They can go to work for an international company, or even if they're not working for an international company, they can work for a domestic company which is competing with an international company, and they will benefit from that competition. So D workers' wages will fall or stay the same. C worker wages will rise, and inequality in the emerging economy will go up. So notice that this is a very different argument from the comparative advantage argument, which gave rise to the opposite conclusion. Here we have more inequality as a result of globalization. So this and a few slides is the alternative theory that we've developed. Now, what can we do about this? Given that we're unhappy with increasing inequality. How do we stop the inequality? Well, one way might be to try to stop globalization. In my view, that's probably impossible. You probably can't stop globalization, but you would, even if you could, I don't think you would want to do that, because although globalization increases inequality, it does improve the overall prosperity of the country. Look at what happened to China. China's GDP has increased many times over the last 40 years, primarily because of globalization. They wouldn't be where they are today, weren't it for globalization. And yes, they are experiencing more inequality, but it makes more sense to address the inequality directly rather than to stop globalization. So I would argue that the right policy conclusion to draw from the theory that I've outlined is that to improve inequality, to reduce inequality, you want to raise the skill level of the D workers so that they have international opportunities too. You can raise their skill levels through job training. You can raise their skill levels through education. Those are the primary ways of changing the opportunities for the D workers. The problem, of course, is that job training and education are expensive. They're investments, and who is going to pay for those investments? Well, the D workers can't do it themselves because they're too poor. They can't afford to make these investments. And we shouldn't expect the companies that hire the D workers to do it either, because they don't really have the incentive to hire these to train these D workers. Why not? Well, if I'm a D worker and you're a company which is considering hiring me, yes, you could give me some training, but if you give me that training, you're going to raise my skill level, and then that means you're going to have to pay me more. So part of your investment is going to be lost because you will now have to pay me a higher wage. And even worse, once you give me that training, I don't have to work for you. I can go to work for one of your competitors. And if I do that, your investment in me will be lost altogether. So it's too much to expect that private companies, private firms, will make an investment in D workers which will solve the inequality problem. And so that means that if it's going to happen, if the investment is going to happen, it has to come from somebody else. It has to come from some third party. Who is that third party? Well, I think the most obvious candidate is government. The government of the emerging economy can make an investment in the D workers. And from the point of view of this theory, they should make an investment in the D workers. That doesn't mean that they have to train the workers themselves, but what they can do is to give companies the incentive to train the workers by, for example, giving them tax breaks. If the companies get a subsidy for training D workers, then they will be willing to train. So the government could give them a subsidy. But if government doesn't do it, then perhaps international agencies or NGOs could do it, or there could be foreign aid to the very poorest countries like Cambodia or certain African countries, or private foundations might make the investment. But my point is that somebody has to make the investment, and it's not going to happen automatically. There has to be a policy to do it. It's not going to be the problem is not going to be solved by pure capitalism. There has to be some intervention on the part of government or someone else. So, in conclusion, if you accept the theory that I've outlined, I think the right course of action is pretty clear. It's not to try to stop globalization, which I think is a hopeless exercise anyway. It's to invest in e-workers, to give them the skills they need so that they too can share in the fruits of globalization. And with that summary, let me stop and thank you for your attention.